Imagine a boy of just 8 years old, suddenly ascending to the throne, King Josiah. This was a challenging time for Judah, filled with corruption and idol worship inherited from his grandfather Manasseh, one of Judah's most idolatrous rulers. Manasseh had introduced numerous foreign altars, false idols, and rituals that distanced the people from God. Manasseh became king at just 12 years old and reigned for 55 years, during which he led Judah into deep spiritual darkness. He adopted the practices of the surrounding nations, influenced by political alliances and the desire to consolidate power by integrating popular pagan worship into Judah's culture. These practices included the worship of Baal, the setting up of Asherah poles, which were wooden symbols associated with the Canaanite goddess Asherah, representing fertility and often placed beside altars, and even child sacrifices in the valley of Hinnom, abominable acts that deeply provoked God's anger. Despite eventually repenting in his later years after being taken captive by the Assyrians, the spiritual damage done to Judah was extensive, leaving a legacy of idolatry that was hard to erase. Even Josiah's father, Ammon, continued these pagan practices, further entrenching idol worship and moral decay in the kingdom. Before we continue, I want to ask you to leave a like on the video to support us. And if you enjoy this kind of content, subscribe to the channel and also click the notification bell. God bless you. The kingdom was spiritually weakened, and Josiah's reign began amidst this deep cultural decay. Despite his young age, Josiah showed a spark of hope, a heart eager for true worship. Unlike his predecessors, Josiah had an innate desire to seek the true God, a spark likely kindled by the teachings he received from those who still remembered the covenant with God. He was surrounded by devoted counselors, like Hilkiah the high priest, who guided him in his early days, helping him understand the ways of the true God of Israel. Hilkiah was a significant figure in Josiah's life. Not only was he the high priest, but he also played a central role in the spiritual reforms of Judah. It was Hilkiah who discovered the Book of the Law during the temple's restoration, a discovery that would become pivotal in Josiah's mission to bring Judah back to God. Hilkiah, being a righteous man, played a crucial role in nurturing Josiah's spiritual growth and helping him distinguish between the truth of God's word and the falsehoods propagated by idol worship. Josiah's story is intriguing, not only because of his age, but also his unexpected drive for reform. Growing up amid idolatry, the easiest path would have been to continue in his father's footsteps, allowing Judah's people to remain comfortable with their idols and foreign altars. But Josiah's spirit longed for something better. Judah was in desperate need of revival, and Josiah was intent on bringing it. Though surrounded by temptation to conform, he listened to his counselors, seeking wisdom and clarity. This initial desire would soon fuel his devotion to cleansing Judah from false worship, setting the stage for a remarkable reign unlike any Judah had seen in generations. In the second book of Kings, chapter 22, verses 1 to 2, it is recorded that Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, walking in the ways of David without turning aside. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 31 years. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and followed completely the ways of his ancestor David, not turning aside to the right or to the left. Similarly, in the second book of Chronicles, chapter 34, verses 1 to 3, it describes Josiah's early reign and his commitment to seeking God. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 31 years. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and followed the ways of his ancestor David, not turning aside to the right or to the left. In the 8th year of his reign, while he was still young, around 16 years old, Josiah began to seek the God of his ancestor David, wanting to learn about and follow the true faith of Israel. In his 12th year, when he was about 20 years old, Josiah began a major campaign to rid Judah and Jerusalem of all elements of idolatry. He ordered the destruction of the high places, sites of unauthorized worship, often located on hilltops. He also removed the Asherah poles, which were wooden symbols associated with the Canaanite goddess Asherah and represented fertility, as well as destroyed all idols that the people used in their worship of false gods. This effort was aimed at purifying the worship practices of Judah and restoring exclusive devotion to the true God of Israel. In a kingdom spiraling spiritually, Josiah's resilience stood out. It wasn't typical for a young king to tackle the entrenched traditions of his nation. Judah's people were deeply invested in their idols, and foreign customs had woven into their daily lives. But Josiah's dedication went beyond politics. He wasn't simply taking the throne to gain power or keep the peace. He was set on a path to renew Judah's covenant with God. This determination laid the groundwork for Josiah's reforms, which would lead Judah back to true worship and spiritual purity, a daunting task, given the overwhelming presence of idol worship throughout his realm. Josiah's reign began in the shadow of his grandfather, Manasseh's legacy, a ruler who'd introduced practices so far from the God of Israel that Judah barely recognized its own spiritual identity. Josiah, however, didn't shy away from the challenge. He sought guidance and wisdom from men of faith like Hilkiah, who would be instrumental in his reforms. Even as a child, Josiah seemed to recognize that Judah's legacy wasn't rooted in idol worship, but in the covenant with God. The coming years would reveal just how committed he was to redefining Judah's spiritual direction and reshaping its relationship with God. This young king's journey to faith didn't start with drastic measures. It began with seeking guidance, listening, and observing. His inner circle, including the prophetess Huldah, would play essential roles, but the spark for change was within Josiah himself. His heart for true worship grew with each passing day, and though the task ahead was immense, Josiah was ready to lead. How would a young boy, facing a kingdom lost to idolatry, transform his people's hearts? This question set the stage for the bold actions Josiah would soon take to cleanse Judah and restore its legacy. By the time Josiah turned 16, he'd found his inspiration in his ancestor, King David, a figure known for his devotion to God and his unyielding sense of justice. Josiah learned about David through the teachings of the priests, particularly Hilkiah, who would often recount the stories of David's faith and his dedication to God. Additionally, Josiah had access to historical records that were preserved in Judah, such as genealogies, chronicles of the kings, and other sacred writings that documented the history of Israel, including David's reign. These records were likely kept in the temple and were part of the official archives of Judah. Evidence of such records is seen in the discovery of the Book of the Law during the temple restoration, as mentioned in 2 Chronicles, chapter 34. The Book of the Law was discovered by Hilkiah the high priest while overseeing repairs to the temple, which had fallen into disrepair due to neglect under previous kings. The Book of the Law likely contained significant portions of the teachings of Moses, including commandments and guidelines for worship, which had been lost or neglected during previous generations of idolatry. When Hilkiah found the book, he gave it to Shaphan the scribe, who then read it to King Josiah. Upon hearing its contents, Josiah was deeply moved and realized how far Judah had strayed from God's commands. This discovery highlighted that sacred texts and historical accounts were indeed maintained and passed down, even if they had been forgotten or hidden. It also became a pivotal moment that led Josiah to enact widespread reforms, focusing on restoring proper worship and adherence to God's covenant. The Book of the Law served as a reminder of the covenant between God and Israel and became a central part of Josiah's reforms, guiding his mission to restore true worship in Judah. Hilkiah, as the high priest, would have been directly responsible for teaching these scriptures to Josiah, helping him understand the importance of following the true God and using David's story as an inspiring example of faith and leadership. These records likely included accounts of David's battles, his psalms, and his covenant with God, which highlighted his deep faith. It is believed that around 300 years had passed since David's reign until Josiah's time, meaning that these records were carefully preserved over generations. The priests used these writings to teach Josiah about David's character and his heart for God. David's story, one of courage and heartfelt faith, became a model for young Josiah. While other kings had strayed from the path, Josiah saw in David a reflection of true leadership grounded in integrity, which inspired him to pursue similar reforms in Judah. Judah, still caught up in its idolatrous practices, presented countless temptations. Yet Josiah's determination to mirror David's faith and pursuit of justice set him on a path of spiritual maturity. He wasn't just filling a throne, he was walking a path that required humility, wisdom, and above all, a heart focused on God. This growing faith wasn't just personal, it started shaping Josiah's rule. Judah's people saw a young king who chose the ways of David, refusing the idols that had captivated generations. David's legacy, as a man after God's own heart, wasn't just a story from the past for Josiah. It was a living example he could follow. With each decision, Josiah leaned toward God's ways, gradually distancing himself from the ingrained idolatry of his predecessors. His life wasn't about half measures. Every action was rooted in a sincere desire for God's justice, a quality Judah hadn't seen in its rulers for many generations, since the time of David and Solomon. The people had become accustomed to rulers who either ignored or actively promoted idol worship, making Josiah's steadfast dedication to God a stark and refreshing change. His commitment to true worship and justice was something that had been absent from Judah for centuries, bringing a sense of hope that many had not experienced in generations. By dedicating himself to David's example, Josiah's young reign began to look different from any his people had seen. While past kings had allowed altars and images to foreign gods, Josiah would soon prepare to confront them directly. His journey wasn't about political gain or appeasing the powerful, it was about standing firm in his faith. Josiah's choices carried significant risks, as idolatry was deeply woven into Judah's society. The people worshipped other gods for various reasons. Some believed these deities could provide fertility, good harvests, or protection, while others followed the practices because they were popular and culturally accepted. Additionally, idol worship was often tied to political alliances with neighboring nations, which helped maintain peace and economic stability. Many influential leaders and citizens were invested in the idol worship system, either economically or culturally, benefiting from the rituals and the political advantages they brought. The economic benefits included profits from the sale of sacrificial animals and goods used in rituals, as well as income from festivals and ceremonies dedicated to these gods. Politically, maintaining idol worship helped secure alliances with surrounding nations that also practiced similar forms of worship, ensuring mutual support and reduced conflict. Confronting these practices could lead to unrest, resistance from those benefiting from idolatrous rituals, or even attempts on his life. Yet the king's heart sought righteousness, and this inner commitment to true worship would prove essential in the reforms he was preparing to launch. David's influence over Josiah wasn't just historical, it was deeply personal. Josiah's faith grew as he learned of David's trust in God through the Psalms, such as the 23rd Psalm, where David expresses his confidence in God's guidance and protection, and the stories passed down through generations, as recorded in the 1st and 2nd books of Samuel and the 1st and 2nd books of Chronicles. These tales weren't just records of battles and victories, they were glimpses of a heart fully devoted to God's commands, showing David's deep relationship with God, his repentance after mistakes, as seen in the 2nd book of Samuel, chapter 12, after his sin with Bathsheba, and his dedication to justice and righteousness. Josiah knew that to lead Judah back to spiritual purity, he'd have to follow David's path, one of courage, resilience, and a commitment to justice, even when facing opposition. Josiah understood that David's journey wasn't without risks, including battles against enemies like Goliath, as detailed in the 1st book of Samuel, chapter 17, and the challenge of keeping the nation unified under God's laws. These examples inspired Josiah to face similar challenges with the same determination. And with each passing year, Josiah's devotion only strengthened, preparing him for the challenges ahead. But how could Josiah reshape Judah's faith without taking drastic steps? His heart was ready, but the next part of his journey would test his resolve. Idol worship was still rampant, and many of these idols were deeply ingrained in the culture, having stood for generations. The high places and altars to foreign gods were not just symbols of worship. They represented economic interests, political alliances, and a way of life for many in Judah. Josiah knew that if he was to restore the covenant fully, he'd have to tackle these practices head-on, despite the risks of facing opposition from those who benefited from idol worship. His inspiration from David, though crucial, would need to translate into decisive actions against entrenched systems. How would a young king begin removing idols that had stood for years, often supported by influential leaders and even the broader community? Josiah's faith was about to move from admiration to bold reform, marking a new chapter in Judah's revival, one that required immense courage and determination. At 20, Josiah began what would be remembered as one of Judah's most radical transformations. Inspired by David's devotion and fueled by his desire for Judah's revival, he set out to rid the land of idol worship. This wasn't just about tearing down altars, it was a call to cleanse Judah from years of pagan influence that had seeped into every aspect of life, religious, social, and even political. Josiah knew that if his people were to experience true worship again, these symbols of idolatry had to go. With a steady resolve, he targeted the high places and shrines that honored foreign gods like Baal and Asherah, gods his ancestors had allowed to flourish. These high places were often located on hilltops and had become centers for rituals that drew the people away from God. The shrines were deeply rooted in the culture, representing alliances with neighboring nations and promises of prosperity. Josiah's actions were bold, as removing these sites meant challenging long-standing traditions and risking backlash from those who had benefited from these practices, including influential leaders and local communities. Yet, Josiah pressed forward, determined to bring about a spiritual renewal that would redefine Judah's identity. Josiah didn't just remove these idols, he destroyed them, making sure there was no trace left. The high places, elevated sites often used for unauthorized worship of foreign gods like Baal and Asherah, were once filled with offerings to false deities. But now they lay barren, their stones scattered and broken. Baal was considered a god of storms and fertility, while Asherah was associated with motherhood and fertility, making their worship deeply rooted in the culture and daily life of the people. Josiah's actions against these idols are recorded in the second book of Kings, chapter 23, verses 4 to 20, where it details how he ordered the priests of these high places to be removed and the altars destroyed. The king ordered Hilkiah the high priest, the priests next in rank, and the doorkeepers to remove from the temple of the Lord all the articles made for Baal and Asherah and all the starry hosts. He burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of the Kidron Valley and took the ashes to Bethel. These actions were shocking to many, especially since these high places had stood for generations and were central to both the economy and political alliances. However, for those yearning for a return to the God of Israel, it brought hope. Josiah's actions were bold, even dangerous, as he challenged not only the practices of idol worship, but also the powerful individuals who benefited from these rituals, priests, leaders, and those who profited economically from the festivals and sacrifices. He knew he would face significant opposition, yet his unwavering commitment to God drove him forward, undeterred by the backlash. For the people of Judah, Josiah's reforms sent a powerful signal. Their king was fully committed to restoring true worship of the God of Israel. While some in Judah felt discomfort as these altars were destroyed, disrupting traditions they had known for generations, others welcomed his actions with a renewed sense of hope, seeing in Josiah the promise of a return to spiritual purity. Josiah's reforms didn't stop with the most visible sites. He extended his mission across every town and village, determined to rid Judah of any trace of idolatry, no matter how small or remote. This dedication mirrored his renewed covenant, demonstrating his willingness to lead Judah back to its true faith. His steadfast approach, as detailed in the second book of Kings, chapter 23, verses 4 to 20, left no room for compromise. Josiah ordered Hilkiah the high priest and others to remove all items dedicated to Baal, Asherah, and celestial deities, burning them outside Jerusalem in the Kidron Valley and scattering the ashes at Bethel. This unwavering commitment ensured that Judah's worship was directed solely to the God of Israel, as further affirmed in the second book of Chronicles, chapter 34. Josiah's reforms were more than mere destruction. They were a profound spiritual stand. By dismantling idols, he reignited Judah's connection to its divine heritage. Each fallen altar was a step toward restoring their true faith, and the people saw in Josiah a leader who would not settle for half measures. His vision of a purified Judah inspired others to leave behind the idolatrous practices they once followed. Yet, these actions marked only the start of his plan to rebuild Judah's devotion from the ground up. For Josiah, this was not a temporary change but a lasting foundation for a true covenant with God. Although his reforms seemed thorough, Josiah knew there was more work ahead. Removing idols was crucial, but it didn't answer the deeper question of how Judah would reconnect with God's commandments. With the idols gone, the next challenge was restoring Judah's understanding of the law and the covenant. Would his people embrace this renewal fully, or would they return to idolatry after his reign ended? Josiah's determination to guide Judah toward God would soon lead him to an unexpected trial, testing his faith and commitment to an even greater extent. After implementing the initial religious reforms, Josiah knew he needed to consolidate the changes he had begun to ensure that the people of Judah remained faithful to the God of Israel. He was not satisfied with just destroying the altars and idols. Josiah also focused on strengthening the people's faith and reaffirming the importance of the covenant with God. To achieve this, he led efforts to educate the people about the law and encourage obedience to God's commandments, as recorded in the second book of Chronicles, chapter 34, verse 30, where Josiah gathered all the people, from the least to the greatest, and went up to the temple of the Lord. He read aloud the book of the covenant, which had been found in the temple, to ensure that everyone, from the highest officials to the common people, understood the importance of returning to God's ways. This public reading was a solemn event, intended to renew the covenant with God and emphasize the significance of following his commandments. Josiah focused on ensuring that the spiritual reforms were solidified by instituting lasting changes that impacted every aspect of worship in Judah. After removing the altars and idols, Josiah worked on restoring the roles and duties of the priests and Levites, ensuring they were properly instructed and devoted to leading the people in the worship of the true God of Israel. He reinstated the practices outlined in God's law, as described in the second book of Chronicles, chapter 35, where Josiah directed the Levites in their duties and re-established the Passover celebration according to what was written in the law of Moses. Josiah reorganized the temple services to reflect these commandments, reinforcing the commitment to proper worship. His dedication to these reforms was not merely about eliminating false practices, but also about establishing a robust spiritual foundation that would help the people of Judah maintain their faith even after his reign. His actions inspired a deeper, more genuine devotion and set an example of how true worship should be carried out, leaving a legacy of spiritual integrity. Josiah also focused on ensuring that the religious reforms were fully implemented by strengthening the role of the priests and Levites. He emphasized their responsibilities in guiding the people in worship and made sure that the practices in the temple aligned with what was prescribed in God's law. By restoring proper temple worship and ensuring that the religious leaders were committed to following God's commandments, Josiah aimed to establish a foundation for lasting spiritual renewal in Judah, rather than allowing the reforms to be temporary measures. Josiah was determined to ensure that the changes were internalized by everyone, knowing that simply destroying the idols would not be enough to transform the people's hearts. He continued to expand his reforms throughout the kingdom, reaffirming Judah's commitment to God and establishing a pattern of worship that should be followed even after his reign ended. Josiah's dedication served as a powerful example for future generations and as a reminder of the importance of faithfulness to the covenant with God. The challenge lay ahead, and Josiah's conviction grew stronger. If Judah were to be restored, the people had to move beyond repentance. They had to commit wholeheartedly to the covenant once more. After completing the removal of idols and high places, Josiah understood that true spiritual renewal required not just external reforms, but also internal transformation. To solidify the changes he had made, Josiah turned his focus to educating the people of Judah on the law of God. He initiated programs to teach the law throughout the kingdom, ensuring that both the young and old understood the covenant and the expectations God had for his people. Josiah organized gatherings where priests and Levites would read and explain the law to the people, helping them internalize the commandments and understand their spiritual heritage. This was crucial because many had grown up without proper knowledge of God's requirements due to the decades of idolatry under previous kings. By emphasizing education, Josiah aimed to ensure that the commitment to God was deep-rooted and would endure beyond his reign. In addition to public readings, Josiah worked on reinstating key religious festivals, such as the Passover, as described in the second book of Chronicles, chapter 35. This was done not just as a ritual observance, but as a way to reconnect the people with their history and their identity as God's chosen nation. The celebration of the Passover under Josiah was one of the most significant since the days of Samuel, highlighting his dedication to bringing the people back to true worship. Josiah's focus on education and spiritual practices was an effort to create a lasting impact, a foundation that would help Judah remain faithful even after his death. His dedication to teaching the law was meant to cultivate a generation that knew and cherished their relationship with God, leaving a legacy of spiritual awareness and obedience that he hoped would withstand future challenges. Josiah's devotion to Judah's independence and purity was unwavering. When he heard that Pharaoh Necho of Egypt was advancing north to support Assyria against Babylon, Josiah perceived this as a significant threat to Judah's stability and independence. The Assyrians had long been enemies of Judah, having conquered the northern kingdom of Israel and exerted pressure over Judah for decades. Josiah feared that an Egyptian-Assyrian alliance could once again subjugate Judah or threaten its sovereignty. Although the Egyptians were not always direct enemies of Judah, their actions often posed a risk, especially when they aligned themselves with other regional powers. He feared that the Egyptian-Assyrian alliance would weaken Judah's sovereignty and potentially lead to foreign dominance. Despite warnings from Necho, who claimed that his mission was directed by God and had no intent to harm Judah, Josiah decided to intervene. Necho sent messengers to Josiah, saying, "What quarrel is there, king of Judah, between you and me? It is not you I am attacking at this time, but the house with which I am at war. God has told me to hurry, so stop opposing God who is with me, or he will destroy you." Second book of Chronicles, chapter 35, verse 21. This raises the question, would God really be with an Egyptian ruler? The Bible shows that God can use anyone, including foreign leaders, to fulfill his purposes. Just as he used King Cyrus of Persia to release the Israelites from exile, as mentioned in the book of Isaiah, chapter 45, God could have been using Necho as an instrument in his larger plan. Josiah, however, ignored this possibility and took his army to the battlefield at Megiddo to confront the Egyptians. This decision, while demonstrating his determination to protect Judah's sovereignty, also highlighted his vulnerability, as he ignored what could have been a divine warning conveyed through Necho. Josiah faced a formidable opponent, and this choice would ultimately lead to a pivotal and tragic outcome: his death on the battlefield. As the battle unfolded, Josiah was struck by an Egyptian archer, sustaining a fatal injury, as described in the second book of Chronicles, chapter 35, verse 23. Archers shot King Josiah, and he told his officers, "Take me away, I am badly wounded." His soldiers hurried him back to Jerusalem, but it was too late. Josiah's death marked the end of an era for Judah, a time of religious revival and strict adherence to the covenant. The people mourned deeply, realizing the profound loss of a king who had dedicated his life to leading them back to God. The prophet Jeremiah, who had begun his ministry during Josiah's reign, also lamented his passing, recognizing the profound impact of his spiritual leadership, as described in the second book of Chronicles as chapter 35, verse 25. In this verse it is stated, Jeremiah composed laments for Josiah, and to this day all the male and female singers commemorate Josiah in the laments. These became a tradition in Israel and are written in the laments. Although the Bible does not provide detailed interactions between Josiah and Jeremiah, It is likely that Jeremiah's messages and his call for repentance supported Josiah's reforms. Jeremiah's lamentation over Josiah reflects his deep respect for the king's dedication to restoring Judah's covenant with God and highlights how deeply Josiah's spiritual influence resonated with those who desired a faithful Judah. Josiah's death left a void that would soon reveal Judah's underlying fragility. With Josiah gone, Judah began to slip back into idolatry under the rule of his successors. His son Joahaz took the throne, but his reign was short-lived as Pharaoh Necho deposed him after only 3 months. Necho had the power to do this due to his recent victory over Josiah and his desire to extend Egyptian influence in the region. By deposing Joahaz, Necho aimed to exert greater control over Judah, ensuring that the kingdom would align with Egypt's interests rather than remain independent. He replaced Joahaz with Eliakim, renaming him Jehoiakim, and effectively made him a vassal king loyal to Egypt. He replaced Joahaz with Eliakim, renaming him Jehoiakim, and making him a vassal king loyal to Egypt. Unlike Josiah, these kings lacked the spiritual commitment needed to maintain Judah's purity. They allowed idol worship to resurface, undoing much of Josiah's reforms. The people, once inspired by Josiah's passion for true worship, gradually returned to the practices he had eradicated. Josiah's reforms, which had been rooted in a deep desire for covenant faithfulness, were unable to withstand the lack of leadership that followed. Without Josiah's guiding influence and dedication to educating the people in God's law, the spiritual foundation he had established began to crumble, demonstrating how fragile the progress was without continuous reinforcement. This turn back to idolatry led to dire consequences for Judah. Over time, the kingdom's spiritual decline attracted Babylonian aggression, culminating in the fall of Jerusalem and the exile of its people in 586 before Christ. This event is recorded in the second book of Kings, chapter 25, where the Babylonian forces besieged Jerusalem, leading to its eventual destruction and the exile of its inhabitants. Despite these tragic events, Josiah's legacy didn't disappear. His reign became a model of faithfulness and reform that future generations would remember. Even as Judah faced exile, the memory of Josiah's dedication to God and the covenant served as a reminder of what true leadership could achieve, a spiritual purity that shaped Judah's identity and provided hope that restoration was possible. Josiah's life stands as a powerful testament to the impact one person's faith and courage can have on an entire nation. Though his reforms were undone, the inspiration he provided lived on, reminding Judah of their calling. His death marked the beginning of Judah's final decline, but his devotion to God left an indelible mark. For those willing to heed his example, Josiah's story remains a call to true worship and obedience. His legacy challenges us to consider, how will we uphold the values we cherish, especially when facing pressures from all sides? If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to leave a like, comment your thoughts here, and subscribe to our channel to keep following more biblical stories like this one. Your participation is very important to us, and we want to hear your opinions and suggestions. May God bless you.